Hello students, welcome to Study with Master Notes. Again we are back to study Unit 3 of MEG 6, The Puritans as Literary Artists. Okay, so please like, share and subscribe my channel and share with your friends who are in a need of exam time, so they can access all my lectures and score good marks in Ignou exam. Okay, thank you. So we will start Unit 3, The Puritans as Literary Artists. So what are the structure? Here it is the objectives, then introduction, Puritan theory of literature, the literature style of the Puritans, okay, the literature style of the Puritans, then the literary genres of the Puritans, Puritan literature versus Puritan ideology, or how Puritan ideology is sometimes subverted by Puritan literature. Let us sum up questions and suggested readings. Then objectives. Okay. In this unit 1, I shall describe the Puritan theory of literature insofar so as such a theory exists and it is to be extrapolated out of the literary practices of the Puritans. In the analysis of the literary practices of the Puritans, you must pay special attention to the choice of literary style and literary genres. So this unit is about the literary style and literary genres of Puritans. Okay. An attempt will be made to demonstrate how the literature of the Puritans, some of at least effectively distances itself from, if not actually destabilizes Puritan ideology. Okay, so what is the Puritan ideology? We will study. Then come to 3.1 Introduction, Puritan theory of literature. The tenets of Puritan faith hindered any clear formulation of general literary theory. Okay, so clear formation of general literary theory. So Puritan ideology is mainly of clear formulation of general literary theory. Then therefore the Puritans rarely express themselves cohesively and coherently as a group in their appreciation of literature. Nevertheless, they have individually left on record a substantial number of short comments on the art of writing as well as a few long essays. In each instance, the comments are somehow concerned with the question, how can prose or verse be made serviceable to the preacher, historian or pedagogue? Usually, the answers are related to the fulfillment of some far-reaching end. The motive behind Puritan authorship was inevitably utilitarian. Okay? The writer might chronicle the story of his age, narrate the lives of famous personages, arraign unwelcome schools of thought, discourse upon human duties, and compose hymn praise to God. But the end he intended was never merely an enjoyment of Beller's letters or of literature for its own sake. Okay, so these are the major things in Puritan literature movement. The motive behind Puritan authorship was inevitably utilitarian. Okay, the writer might chronicle the story of his age, narrate the lives of famous personages or persons, arraign unwelcome schools of thought, discourse upon human duties, and compose hymn in praise to God. Then this is not to say that writer was always devoid of literary sensibility. Puritans saw expressions of divine imagination in the world around them and drew analogies between the beautiful objects and the perfect archetype, which they conceived as existing in the mind of God. So, in previous chapters, clearly I have mentioned the Puritans concept was based on Jerusalem concept or Christianity. Okay, so they conceived as existing in the mind of God. Beauty was supposedly the order and harmony which God established, and literature useful only insofar as the perusal of it might save human spirit to a better understanding of the divine metaphysic. Literature thus did not deserve more than incidental attention in the Puritan arrangement of things. The literary style of the Puritans. Okay, so what was the literary style? The literature of the Puritans was meant not to be self-foregrounding or self-glorificatory. Okay, the literature of the Puritans was meant not to be self-foregrounding or self-glorificatory. So self-consciousness or self-improvement was not there in Puritan concept. Even before New England was founded, the Puritans had advocated a literary style that was simple, lucid, and controlled. Okay, lucid means clear, was simple, lucid, and controlled, fit to satisfy the intellect, not excite the passions, to instruct, not to titillate. Okay, so not to humiliate or not to titillate, and it is a very simple, lucid, and controlled manner literature. Painful Perkins, Fellow of Christ College, Cambridge, was a Puritan whose evangelical fervor made him one of the most influential leaders. Okay, Painful Perkins, Fellow of Christ College, Cambridge, was a Puritan whose evangelical fervor made him one of the most influential leaders of New England thoughts. He had written in a manual on sermonizing that was the recognized authority in New England, that the minister may and ye must privately use at his liberty the arts, philosophy, and the variety of reading, whilst he is in framing the sermon, but he ought in public to conceal all this from the people. Thomas Hooker warned of such readers as might find the manner of his discourse too logical or scholastical in regard of the terms he used. The plainness and perspicuity, both for matter and manner of expression, are the things that I have consciously endeavored in the whole debate. Okay, the plainness and perspicuity, both for matter and manner of expression, are the things that I have consciously endeavored in the whole debate. But I have ever thought writings that come abroad, they are not to dazzle, but direct the apprehension of the meanest, and I have accounted it to the chiefest part of the judicious learning, to make a hard point easy and familiar in explication. Although Puritans aspired towards a deliberate Spartanness of style, it would be a mistake to think that this style was necessarily insipid and placid. Okay, Puritans aspired towards a deliberate Spartanness of style. It would be a mistake to think that this style was necessarily insipid and placid. The audience aided the minister to maintain an interesting style. Okay, the audience aided the minister to maintain an interesting style. For the Puritan laity esteemed that preaching creditable, whereby the clergymen engaged their enthusiasm without resorting to ornate and elaborated diction. That preaching considered creditable, whereby the clergymen engaged their enthusiasm without resorting to ornate and elaborated diction. The ministers too were wise enough to realize that arid and dull sermons would not hold the respect of an educated flock, nor did they want that the uneducated among their people should be allowed to respect a slipshod oration. Oration means oral talk. Okay, the ministers too were wise enough to realize that arid and dull sermons would not hold the respect of an educated flock, nor did they want the uneducated among their people should be allowed to respect a slipshod oration. One of the greatest preachers in the first quarter of the 17th century, Richard Sibbes, whose works were widely read in New England. Here is the main key point, Richard Sibbes. Okay, so Richard Sibbes, whose works were widely read in New England, enunciated one part of the Puritan theory of style in writing the preface for a fellow Puritan's book. But because the way to come to the heart is often to pass through the fancy, therefore this godly man studied by lively representations to help men's faith by the fancy. It was our Saviour Christ's manner of teaching to express heavenly things in an earthly manner, and it was the study of the wise man Solomon, becoming a preacher, to find out pleasant words or words of delight. Okay? Steve's here reveals that the source for much that is inspirational in Puritan writing was the Bible, the model which justified an indulgence in figures of speech, even though plainness and perspicuity were being elevated at the expense of flourish and finesse. Okay, so Puritan writing, the Richard Steve's writing, so mainly focused on Bible. The model was justified an indulgence in figures of speech, even though plainness and perspicuity were being elevated at the expense of flourish and finesse. However, had the Puritan style derived exclusively from biblical models, it would have lacked the analytical expositions and articulate explanations which happened to be its hallmarks. William M's Textbook of Theology was the standard work used at Harvard and Yale down to the middle of the 18th century. Ames defended the non-ostentatious style of the Puritan preachers, and his example influenced almost every sermon delivered in New England. Ames defended the non-ostentatious style of the Puritan preachers, and his example influenced almost every sermon delivered in New England. The dryness of this style, the harshness of some words will be much blamed by the some person as those who object to the cause and effect framework. But I do prefer to exercise myself in that heresy, and when it is my purpose to teach, I think I should not say that in two words which may be said in one, and that key is to be chosen which doth upon best, although it be of wood, if there be not golden key of the same efficacy. Okay. But economy of words was not to imply insufficient communication. The Spartan style was not proposed to become a boring style. Here you can remember the Spartan style. Okay, the Spartan style was not proposed to become a boring style. As Ames instructed his students on another page, the word of the Lord is a two-edged sword that peereth into the inward thoughts and affections, and goeth through unto the joining together of the bones and marrow. Preaching therefore ought not to be dead, but lively and effectual, so that an unbeliever coming into the congregation of the faithful he ought to be affected, and as it were digged through with the very hearing of the word, that he may give glory to God. The literary genres of the Puritans. Okay. So what was the literary genres of the Puritans? The non-ostentatious style of the Puritans was not confined to their pulpit discourses or devotional paeans alone. Historians from William Bradford, first generation Puritan immigrant, to Cotton Mather, third generation Puritan immigrant. So who was the first generation Puritan immigrant? William Bradford. Okay, you can remember William Bradford. Okay, William Bradford, you can remember, is the first generation immigrant. Okay, William Bradford, you can remember. Okay, then third generation immigrant, Cotton Mather. Okay, Cotton Mather is the third generation immigrant. Here it is the Cotton Mather, third generation Puritan immigrant, brought out narratives about their lives and times with the express purpose of reaching out to every ready reader. Chronicles interwriting the individual and the collective experiences of the Puritans in New England were written by the dozen through the 17th century. The Puritans did not distinguish between the public and the private domains of experience. For them, the church represented the body of Christ, with each member such an integral part that if one person were in distress, the entire body writhed. The entire body writhed. Okay? Entire body writhed. Conversely, if the spiritual community was troubled, each person was afflicted. The single subject striving toward salvation became an objective community mission, serving as an indication of the condition of the congregation, just as the condition of the congregation was reflected in each member. With the extensive interdependence of personal and community history, stable times ensured not only personal assurance but also community assertion against traitors and aliens. Okay? So at that time a communal value was there inside the society. Okay? So one thing affects, entire society was affected. But unstable times engendered community as well as personal self-castigation. In days of darkness, the flock would delve into the depths of their souls to understand the source of God's anger and explain their plight through harsh scrutinies of each other's spiritual lapses. Okay, God's anger and explain their plight through harsh scrutinies of each other's spiritual lapses. Once even a single sinner entered the holy order, the order remained in danger of disintegration. The community must stand together to defeat the threat, and as in the instances of Annie Hutchinson and Roger Williams, or at Salem in 1692. Already in Unit 2, I have covered Annie Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Okay, Annie Hutchinson and Roger Williams, they were the reformer of the society at that time. A remarkable account of the encounter with Abel is in the diary of the eminent minister Michael Wigglesworth, 1631 to 1705, born in Yorkshire, England in 1631. Wigglesworth moved with his parents to New England in 1638 and settled in New Haven. A brilliant student, he studied with the famous schoolmaster Ezekiel Cheever and was writing tracts in Latin by the age of 9. Okay, so here is the history of Michael Wigglesworth. Okay, so Michael Wigglesworth, the remarkable account of the encounter with evil is the diary of the eminent minister Michael Wigglesworth, born in Yorkshire in 1631, England. And Wigglesworth moved with his parents to the New England in 1638, settled in New Haven. A brilliant student, he studied with the famous schoolmaster Ezekiel Cheever and was writing tracts in Latin by the age of 9. After an interruption in his education consequent upon his father's 5-year illness, he went to Harvard, where he studied theology as well as physiology, finished first in his class, obtained an AB and an AM, and remained as a tutor until 1654. In 1655, he married his cousin Mary Rayner, and in 1656 he was ordained as the minister of the church at Malden. Then he entered an excruciating period of painful illness that so weakened him that he could not perform his clerical course. In 1659, when Mary died, Wigglesworth's debilation depended. He declined the presidency of Harvard because he did not think his bodily health and strength competed to undertake such a weighty work. In 1686, however, Wigglesworth experienced a remarkable rejuvenation. He resumed his duties in Malden, but shocked the community by marrying his housekeeper, Martha Muse, who was 25 years younger than he and not a member of his church. But as the marriage endured and reared 6 children, Wigglesworth ultimately regained the respect of his congregation and of the Greater Puritan Association. So Wigglesworth was the minister at that time. Michael Wigglesworth was the minister, eminent minister, and his church story we have read till now. So Wigglesworth was married third time, followed Martha's death to Sybil Avery in 1691 when he was 60. So Wigglesworth diary for the years 1653 to 1657 documents his youthful fears of damnation brought on by nocturnal emissions, sexual desire and masturbation, and his guilt feelings over his anger toward his father, especially about his inability to feel sorrow over his father's death. Okay, here it is the Wigginson diary. You can remember, this is the main point. What was in Wigglesworth diary? So Wigglesworth diary for the year 1653 to 1657. You can remember the years 1653 to 1657. Wigglesworth's diary documents his youthful fears. Okay. In diary, he wrote his youthful fears of damnation brought on by nocturnal emissions, youthful fears and damnation, then sexual desire, masturbation, and his guilt feelings over his anger towards his father. Okay, especially about his inability to feel sorrow over his father's death. Wigglesworth's diary is filled with the kind of statements that have given the Puritans a reputation for obsessive gloom. Okay, so Wigglesworth's diary is filled with the kind of statements that have given the Puritans reputation for obsessive gloom. Innumerable evils compass me about and prevail against me. Wherefore I am afraid and ashamed and unable to see God still loving me with an everlasting love. I find so much of my spirit to go out unto the creative, unto mirth, that there is little savour of God left in my soul. He desperately calling to God. His accounts of his interactions with his students suggest that mirth was probably fairly rare in Wigglesworth's life. I set myself this day to wrestle with the Lord for myself and then for my peoples. But still I see the Lord sorting out my prayers. For he whom in special I prayed for, I heard in the evening with ill company playing music. Though I had solemnly warned him but yesterday of letting his spirit go after pleasures. The lamentations of Puritan diaries sometimes appear forced and formulaic, but the specificity of Wigglesworth's sorrowing to quote Emory Elliot gives convincing evidence of mental anguish. Okay, so Emory Elliot quoted that the account on the Wigglesworth's writing gives convincing evidence of mental anguish. Okay, gives convincing evidence of mental anguish. So Emory Elliot wrote according to Wigglesworth writing. Okay, the autobiography of Increase Matthew is more objective than the Wigglesworth diary, but it too makes clear that even those who had the strongest reasons to expect sanctification experienced periodic incertitude throughout life. Often called the foremost American Puritan, Increase was the son of the first generation minister Richard Mather. Okay, Increase was the son of the first generation minister Richard Mather. He graduated from Harvard in 1656. Okay, he graduated from Harvard in 1656. Completed a master's degree. Okay, completed a master's degree at Trinity College, Dublin. Okay, the autobiography of Increase Mather is more objective than the Wigglesworth diary. Here is the Increase Mather is another person. You can remember Increase Mather is more objective than the Wigglesworth diary. Okay, Increase Mather. But it too makes clear that even those who had the strongest reason to expect sanctification experience periodic incertitude throughout life, often called the foremost American Puritan. Increase was the son of the first generation minister Richard Mather. He graduated from Harvard in 1656. Okay, foremost American Puritan was Increase Mather, graduated from Harvard in 1656, completed a master's degree at Trinity College Dublin, married the daughter of John Cotton, and was pastor of Old North Church, Boston for almost 60 years. A prolific author, he published over 100 works, including histories, sermons, tracts, treatises, and biography of his father. The most eminent minister in New England from about 1670 to the early 1700s, Mather socialized with the highest government officials and the wealthiest merchants. From 1685 to 1701, he served as president of Harvard, which he served through several severe legal and financial crises. Okay, he was the most eminent government official and wealthiest merchants at that time. From 1685 to 1701, he served as president of Harvard, which he served through several legal and financial crises. In 1688, he was chosen for a mission to England to entreat James II to restore the charter, and when William and Mary became the new sovereigns in 1689, Mather negotiated a new charter with them. Although he probably obtained as much for Massachusetts as was possible in the contest, some criticized him for yielding too much and for using his political position to help his friends, especially his nominee for governor, Sir William Phelps. After Phelps' mediocre administration, Mather became embroiled in nasty political battles and suffered a decline of influence until his death 1723. So who was died in 1723? Increase Mather. Over the course of his life, Mather kept a diary, but in 1685 he decided to compose a formal autobiography from his many diary volumes, writing for his children with no intention of publishing. He declared his purpose was to show them how his faith had been sustained through trials and tribulations. One of the most interesting features of the work is the way in which the idea of God's covenant with an individual developed, at least in Mather's mind, to a two-sided agreement in which God had certain obligations. At a low point in his youth, when he was awaiting both his temporal calling to his ministry and his eternal calling to grace, he wrote that the Lord broke in upon my conscience with very terrible convictions and awakenings. I was in the extremity of anguish and horror in my soul. Unable to bear the torture, Mather actually dared to threaten God that, that if he should not answer me graciously others after my decease, that should see the papers which I had written, which I kept as remembrances of my talking before God, would be discouraged. Dilemmas such as are expressed peripherally in the histories of Mather and Wigglesworth are central to the poetry of the Puritans. Okay, the poetry of the Puritans was Increase Mather wrote. The dilemmas such as expressed peripherally in the histories of Mather and Wigglesworth are central to the poetry of the Puritans. The term Puritan poetry itself is somewhat of an oxymoron. Okay, the Puritan poetry itself is somewhat of an oxymoron. In England during the 16th century, Puritan radicals had warned that the senses were unreliable, that appeals to the imagination were dangerous, and that the use of imagistic, figurative, and symbolic language bordered upon idolatry. Okay, so Puritan radicals had warned that the senses were unreliable, that appeals to imagination were dangerous, and that the use of imagistic, figurative, and symbolic language bordered upon idolatry. So, reasoning that God had inscribed all the truth that humanity needed in the scriptures, they held the plain and direct discussion of his word and was the only truly legitimate and temperate mode of verbal expression. The Catholics and the Anglicans' use of graven images, emphasis on pulpit pious, appeals to congregations through music, and ornate vestments were further proof to Puritans that artistry invited idolatry. The Puritans' iconoclastic destruction of religious statuary during the Civil War, their closing of the theatres, the plainness of their churches, and their official statements condemning ornate dress and speech strongly supported a view that Puritan poetry was all but impossible. So, which describes a Puritan poetry was all about impossible. Here you can note the Puritans' iconoclastic Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Livy. Okay. So, yet from the 1940s through the 1960s, scholars continued to discover and exhibit innumerable Puritan poems, many of which contain provocatively striking decorative language and allusions not only to the Bible but also to classical models such as Ovid, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Livy. Numerous poems also contain intertextual references to the work of contemporary poets, among them Spenser, Sidney, Shakespeare, Herbert, Vaughan, and Quarles. Such evidence of an apparent gap between Puritan theory and Puritan practice in the realm of poetry continues to appear. So you can here remember numerous poems also contain intertextual references to the work of contemporary poets. Among them Spenser, Sidney, Shakespeare, Herbert, Vaughan, and Quarles. Already in MEG 1 we have read these things. Okay. Then here is the Eminent Puritans Cotton Method. Okay. George Samuel Sewell, this is left, helped to burn of witches, made public repentance, and wrote a chatty diary. Then the Puritans as literary artists. John Winthrop, first governor under the charter. In Unit 1 we have covered. In Unit 3 also, Raven, Richard Mather, and William Pincon. Okay, William Pincon. Then it is important to remember that the Puritans who emigrated to New England had been, after all, heirs to a rich literary tradition, and many must have cherished the beauty of the language and the literature in spite of religious scruples. Okay, so the Puritans who emigrated to New England had been, after all, heirs to a rich literary tradition, and many must have cherished the beauty of the language and literature in spite of religious scruples. Eventually, the minister expanded their doctrines and discovered various intricacies in them that allowed an increase in the quantity and quality of artistic creations. By 1650, a major shift had become evident, authorizing writers to use sensual imagery more freely and even to strive consciously for stylization. A notable sign of this change was the revised translation of the Bay Bislam book undertaken in 1651 by President Henry Downster of Harvard and Richard Lyon, who said they had a special eye for the sweetness of the verse. Cotton Mather later said of his edition that it was thought that a little more of art was to be employed upon the verses. The movement toward the verbal artistry received its strongest official endorsement from the eminent English Puritan Richard Baxter, 1615 to 1991, in his highly popular The Saints' Everlasting Rest. So here you can remember the official endorsement, the verbal artistry, the eminent English Puritan Richard Baxter. Okay, Richard Baxter was there. So Richard Baxter in 1615 to 91 in his highly popular The Saints' Everlasting Rest. Okay, Richard Baxter, Saints' Everlasting Rest. The Saints' Everlasting Rest. Okay, Richard Baxter. So you can remember. A military chaplain in the Puritan. The military chaplain in the Puritan army during the Civil War and a respected anti-papist, Baxter could be trusted to deal safely with such sensitive issues such as the use of the senses, imagination, and imagery in the poetic processes. Okay, Baxter could be trusted to deal safely with such sensitive issues such as the use of senses, imagination, and imagery in the poetic processes. Intended primarily as a handbook for tracking the stages of the saint's spiritual journey, Baxter's work also had important implications for legitimizing literary invention because he endorsed appeals to the imagination. Baxter argued that God gave humanity a plastic language in order to enhance people's abilities to perceive his truths. Okay, Baxter argued that God gave humanity a plastic language in order to enhance people's abilities to perceive his truths. Highlighting the many uses of images in the Bible, he proposed that these, with most other descriptions of our glory, are expressed as if it were the very flesh and sense, which, though they were all improper and figurative, yet doubtless, if such expression had not been best and to us necessary, the Holy Ghost would not have so frequently used them. Highlighting the many uses of images in the Bible, he proposed that these, with most other description of her glory, are expressed as if it were the very flesh and sense, which, though they were all improper and figurative, yet doubtless, if such expressions had not been best and to us necessary, yet doubtless, if such expression had not been best, had to us necessary, the Holy Ghost would not have so frequently used them. Therefore, enjoins Baxter, people were obliged to use this God-given system and to take delight in the world of objects, which is itself an image, a taste of God's instruction. The other developing component of Puritan thought that served to certify a Puritan poetics was the more liberal employment of biblical typology. The routine clerical explications of the Old Testament types in the New Testament antitypes had established a mode of symbolic expression. In the early decades of the settlements, some clergy warned against the extension of the hermeneutic method, but gradually the creative impulses of the Puritan ministers and other writers and the inviting vision of New England as New Jerusalem led to a most liberal use of typology, opening the system towards more elaborate constructs engaging biblical types as well as historical events, moral formulations, and even the characters of well known individuals. Present day reappraisals of Puritan poetry have served to reconfigure conceptions of Puritan poetics with a new awareness that it was very possible for a Puritan poet to strive intentionally for artfulness. Readers have been less inclined to dismiss newly discovered productions and more open to recognizing aesthetic achievement. If Puritan poetry projected the dilemmas of individual Puritans in the process of adhering to their faith, this crisis of faith was addressed in different way by the Puritan ministers in the sermons that they delivered to the collective group or the flock, now known as Puritan Jeremiads. These sermons selected their text from Jeremiah and Isaiah and reinscribed a rhetorical formula that included recalling the courage and pity of founders, lamenting recent and current ills, and crying out for a return to the original commitment and conviction. In current scholarship, the term Jeremiad has expanded to include not only sermons but also other texts that rehearse the familiar tropes of the formula such as letters, covenant renewals, as well as confessions. Okay, here you can remember in current scholarship the term Jeremiad. Okay, what is the term Jeremiad? Has expanded to include not only sermons, okay, but also as well as covenant renewals, letters, and confessions was in Jeremiad. Okay, Jeremiad. The specific circumstance in which the Jeremiad emerged as a literary genre was a series of traumas that afflicted the Massachusetts Bay Colony between 1660 and 1690. These included impersonal disasters such as fires, floods, droughts, and earthquakes. Okay, Massachusetts Bay Colony. There included impersonal disasters such as fires, flood, droughts, earthquakes, the appearance of comets, and human missiles such as renewed fighting with the Indians, growing materialism, increasing occurrences of dissent from within the ranks, and a general decline of the religious spirit. Whether an actual decline of religious zeal among the Puritans in these decades did happen remains one of the most debated issues in Puritan scholarship. Church membership records suggest that the decline in membership may have been a myth born on the Jeremiah ritual and the compulsion to place blame for what seemed otherwise to be inexplicable calamities. Yet a shared perception of moral deterioration accrued social and political force and inspired many of the colony's most interesting literary texts. And indeed, the trope of decline became central to later Puritan expressions. Overall, the Jeremiads had a complicated, seemingly contradictory communal function. On the one hand, they were designed to awaken a lethargic people. On the other hand, in their repetitive and ritualistic nature, they functioned as a form of reassurance, reinscribing proof that the Puritans were still a united denomination who ruled New England in covenant with God and under his sometimes chastising and yet ultimately protective hand. The tension between these completing yet finally reconciled purposes gives the Jeremiads their literary richness. Okay, here the Jeremiads' literary richness was described in this paragraph. The most striking instance of the genre is Samuel Danforth's. Okay, here it is the Danforth's 1626 to 1674, a brief record of New England's errand into the wilderness, which was preached in 1670 and published the following year. Born in Framlingham, Suffolk, England, Danforth had lost his mother when he was 3 and came with his father to New England. Okay, born in Framlingham, Suffolk, England. Okay, born in Framlingham, Suffolk, England. Danforth had lost his mother when he was 3 and came with his father to the New England in 1634. Okay, lost his mother and he was 3 and came with his father to New England in 1634 when he was 8. He graduated from Harvard in 1643 and accepted a post as minister in Roxbury in 1650, where he served with John Eliot, whose missionary work among the Indians left Danforth to perform the major responsibilities of the parish. In 1651, Danforth married Mary Wilson of Boston, and they had 12 children. Okay, Danforth married in 1651 Mary Wilson, Boston, and they had 12 children, several of whom died young. Although he took his test for his famous Jeremiah from Matthew 11:7-9 and not Jeremiah or Isaiah, Danforth announced in his preface that his theme was the loss of first love, being a radical disease too tremendously growing upon us, and he declared the observation of the declension, justly calling for so meet an antidote. From a literary perspective, Danforth's project is particularly notable for its imaginative evocation of wilderness imagery and its incorporation in the final pages of a dramatic dialogue between Danforth and a community of fearful listeners. The text thus can be read as resonant with Christ's ironic dialogue with followers of John and Baptist upon John's return from the desert where he began his ministry. Okay, John the Baptist upon John's return. The doctrine that Danforth draws from the text from a typological connection between John and the Puritan founders. Okay, both are such as have sometimes left their pleasant cities and habitations to enjoy the pure worship of God in a wilderness. Like those who followed John and eventually lost interest in his preaching, some Puritans are apt in time to abate and cool in their affection, at which point the Lord calls upon them seriously and thoroughly to examine themselves, which it was that drew them into the wilderness. The 1670s through the 1680s witnessed preachers using election days, fast days, funerals, execution, and many social events to perform the Jeremiad ritual. And more often than not, the emergent generation was the target. Increased Mather proved masterful in his exploitation of the genre, and with four such sermons each, he and his son Cotton preached more election sermons than any other ministers. In addition to his classic Day of Trouble is Near 1674, increased Jeremiads included a renewal of covenant, the great duty incumbent on decaying and distressed churches 1677, pray for the rising generation, a call from heaven to the present and succeeding generations. A few other titles of famous Jeremiads convey a sense of the consistency of theme. William Adams, the necessity of pouring out of spirit from on high upon a signing, apostating people. Samuel Hooker's righteousness regained from heaven. Urian Oakes, New England pleaded with. Thomas Shepard, Junior I slave, or a watchword to take heed of apostasy. Jonathan Michaels, Nehemiah, on the wall in troubled times, and Thomas Wallace Baum in Gilead to heal Gion's wounds. Whether the clergy continued to preach Jeremiah after the 1680s is not certain, but certain it is that fewer such sermons were printed in the 18th century. The sermons that were published were on the whole more encouraging and cheerful, less engrossed by the fall of moral standards, and thus not quite quintessentially Puritan. Then come to Puritan literature versus Puritan ideology, or how Puritan ideology is sometimes subverted by Puritan literature. Curiously, the quintessentially Puritan author of the 17th century too had sometimes scripted texts that militated against the ideology of the Puritans. Two instances of such subversive authorship ought to suffice to prove this point. Annie Bradstreet, born in Northampton, England, was the daughter of Thomas Dudley, steward of the Lont Puritan, the Earl of Lincoln. Brought up in aristocratic surroundings, she was given an education unusual for women at the period and enjoyed the resources of the Earl of Lincoln's magnificent library at Sempridham Castle. Okay, she was brought up in aristocratic surroundings and she is given an education unusual for women at that period and enjoyed the resources of the Earl of Lincoln's magnificent library at Sempringham Castle. When she was 16, she married Simon Bradstreet, a graduate of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Okay, Simon Bradstreet, he got married. Steward of the Countess of Warwick and in a small way, Proteus of Thomas Dudley. When she was 18, Annie Simon and her parents sailed with John Winthrop abroad the Arabella of Massachusetts Bay, where both her husband and her father later became governors. Her husband and her father later became governors. An exemplary wife, housekeeper, and mother of 8 children, she was nevertheless a purchaser of the emancipated woman of modern days because she could not fully reconcile herself to a life completely limited by children, kitchen, and church. Apparently, every minute she could do so she devoted to writing verses, letters, and diary notes. In this, she not only showed her strength of character and her passionate love for her husband and children, but also her learning and her uneasiness about being unable to submit as constantly and dutifully as a good Puritan matron should to a total acceptance of the orthodox beliefs of her sect. Okay. Her first book was taken in manuscript to London by John Woodbridge, a relative. In 1650, it was published in England under a title not of Mrs. Bradstreet's choosing. The 10th Muse lately sprung up in America. Okay, so who wrote? Annie Bradstreet. Okay, so Annie Bradstreet wrote, "The 10th muse lately sprung up in America are several poems compiled with great variety of wit and learning, full of delight, by a gentlewoman in those parts. The poems were attempts to versify not only her moral and religious sentiments, but also contemporary scientific ideas, and they reflected the psychology, physiology, physics, natural science, and correspondences of the Renaissance. Published as quaternions, the poems included the four elements, the four ages of the man, okay, the four humors in man's constitution, the four seasons of the year, the four monarchies. As intellectual exercises, they speak the influence of the Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, Plutarch, Usser, Francis Squirrel's Emblems, the Bible, and most particularly the Sylvester translation of Last Sermon by Guillaume de Bartas. Comparatively little is known about the early years of Edward Taylor, America's greatest colonial poet. Okay, Edward Taylor was the American's greatest colonial poet. He was born in Leicestershire, England. Okay, Leicestershire, England, either in Coventry or Sketchley, probably in 1645, and probably to a dissenting family. Okay, Edward Taylor. In any case, British universities were not hospitable to young Puritans during the persecutions of the 1660s. Furthermore, the loyalty oaths in favor of the monarchy required after the Restoration were repugnant to a man of Taylor's persuasions. Thus, armed with letters of introduction to the inflational increase method, second generation New England minister and the moneyed John Hull Taylor arrived in Boston in July 1668, a refugee in search of formal education. Subsequently, he went to Harvard, where he earned distinctions and became a close friend of Samuel Sewall. He was graduated in 1671 and accepted a call to the ministry at Westfield, Massachusetts. There he spent the remaining 58 years of his life as a physician and a passionate, engaging, and brilliant pastor. He was married twice and 13 children, was honored with a master's degree by Harvard in 1720. This is about all that is known about the private life of Edward Taylor. As far as public life is concerned, of course, there is the remarkable manuscript book of poetry he produced, although it is a mistake to think that the ecstasy expressed in his poems was not representative of a Puritan pity. Taylor's occasional certitude of bliss and emphasis on joy came close to the heresies of antinomianism, pleasure, Pelagianism, and enthusiasm. Okay, what was the Taylor's writing? The Taylor's occasional certitude of bliss and emphasis on joy came close to the heresies of antinomianism, Pelagianism, and enthusiasm. Okay, so here this is the main point, that is Taylor's occasional certitude of bliss, emphasis on joy came close to the heresies of antinomianism, Pelagianism, and enthusiasm. Okay, then it's the Edward Taylor. Much later, his grandson, President Ezra Stiles of Yale, presented the manuscripts to the Yale Library in 1783. Okay, President Ezra Stiles, his grandson. In 1937, Thomas H. Johnson announced the discovery of this hitherto obscure exemplar of colonial literature in an article published in the New England Quarterly. In 1939, Johnson published selection from the manuscripts in the form of a compilation. The basic groupings of the manuscripts book are God's Determinations, which in highly unorthodox fashion celebrates the primacy of divine mercy rather than justice. Okay, God's Determination, the basic groupings of the manuscript book, was written 1939. Johnson published. Okay, God's Determination, which in highly unorthodox fashion celebrates the primacy of divine mercy rather than justice for man caught in the continuing war between Christ and Satan. Okay, that is God determinations, the continuing war between Christ and Satan. 5 poems and sacramental meditations, which expresses a fervent yearning for an expectation of ecstasy in acceptance by Christ. Then let us sum up. In this unit, I have tried to outline the Puritan theory of literature insofar as such a theory exists and it is to be extrapolated out of the literary practices of the Puritans. Special attention has been accorded to the Puritans' selection of the literary styles and literary genres. Instances of how the literary often militates against the ideological in the realm of Puritan writing receive special concentration in this unit. Then questions. Outline some of the outstanding tenets of the literary theory of the Puritans. Comment on how the Puritan selection of literary styles and literary genres abides by the tenets of their literary theory. Give instances of how Puritan literature might militate against Puritan ideology. Then suggested readings. Okay. So keep watching my videos till end and get some notification. Push the bell icon to get the earliest notification. Thank you friends.